In the winter of 1982, on the ordinary Thursday afternoon of January 11th, Elena Torres stood behind the counter of a McDonald's restaurant near Duke Street in West Alexandria, Virginia, watching two men who would never acknowledge each other's existence. The restaurant occupied a corner lot in a mundane commercial strip flanked by a dry cleaner and a hardware store where commuters stopped on their way home from Washington, the kind of place where nothing remarkable ever happened. Elena had worked the lunch and dinner shifts for 3 years, long enough to recognize the patterns of her regular customers, long enough to notice when something didn't fit. She was 25 years old, a shift supervisor earning $4.15, an hour responsible for manning the front register during the after-work rush when office workers and contractors streamed through the doors seeking quick meals before the long commute north toward the capital or south toward Quantico. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The fryers hissed. The mechanical chime announced each customer. Everything was exactly as it had always been, except for the two men and the bag they pretended didn't exist. The older man arrived first, always first, entering through the glass double doors at approximately 5:47 p.m. Elena would later describe him to federal investigators as appearing to be in his late 50s, perhaps early 60s, with silver-gray hair combed, precisely back from a high forehead, wearing unremarkable business attire, dark slacks, button-down shirts in muted colors, occasionally a tan raincoat when the weather demanded it. He carried himself with the bearing of a mid-level bureaucrat or long-time civil servant, someone who had spent decades in offices where nothing exciting ever occurred. He ordered the same meal every time. A Big Mac, medium fries, black coffee. He paid in exact change, counting out the bills and coins with deliberate care. He took his food on a brown plastic tray, not in a bag, and carried it to a booth along the western wall, the one beside the window that offered a clear view of the parking lot and Duke Street beyond. He sat. He ate methodically, never rushing. He read a newspaper, always the Washington Post, always the business section. He finished his meal in approximately 18 minutes. Then he stood, gathered his tray, walked to the waste receptacle near the front counter, and disposed of his trash. The tray he left on the metal ledge above the bin, standing upright against the wall. Always upright, never flat. And always, without exception, a white McDonald's takeout bag sat on that tray, folded closed at the top, appearing full enough to contain leftover food, though Ina had watched him eat everything on his tray. The bag was the anomaly. The bag didn't belong. The younger man arrived 8 to 12 minutes later, never sooner, never later by more than a few minutes, as if operating on some invisible timer synchronized to movements Elena couldn't see. He was perhaps 40 years old, clean-shaven, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the fluorescent light. He wore the bland uniform of Northern Virginia's defense contractor, Corridor khaki pants, polo shirts or button-downs, sometimes a windbreaker with no identifying logos. He ordered differently each time, sometimes a quarter-pounder, sometimes a filet-o-fish, sometimes just coffee and apple pie. He carried his food to a different table than the older man, usually near the eastern wall, or sometimes at the counter seats by the window facing the side parking lot. They never made eye contact. They never spoke. They never acknowledged each other's presence in any observable way. The younger man ate quickly, rarely spending more than 10 minutes at his table. When he finished, he stood, approached the waste receptacle, and disposed of his trash just as the older man had done. But he never brought his own tray to the ledge. Instead, he picked up the tray the older man had left, the one with the upright white bag, carried it back to his table, and appeared to inspect the contents. 30 seconds later, perhaps 45, he returned to the waste bin and disposed of everything, the tray, the bag, all of it thrown into the receptacle. Then he left through the same glass doors, walking to a different section of the parking lot and the older man driving away in a light blue Ford sedan that Elena could unidentify beyond the color and the approximate year mid-70s perhaps. The entire sequence took less than 4 minutes, and it happened without variation, without deviation, without any indication that these two men knew each other existed. Elena told no one about this observation, not immediately, because what was there to tell? 2 men ate at McDonald's. 2 men threw away their trash. There was no crime in that, no violation of any rule Elena knew. She rationalized it the way anyone would rationalize a small oddity that disrupts the pattern of normal life. Perhaps they worked together, and this was some kind of inside joke, or perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps she was simply imagining connections that didn't exist. But the pattern repeated. January 11th, January 28th. Each time, the same sequence. The older man first, the meal, the tray with the upright bag, the younger man's arrival, the transfer that wasn't quite a transfer because no one handed anything to anyone. Elena began to watch more carefully during the late afternoon shifts, positioning herself at the front register where she had an unobstructed view of the waste receptacle in the dining area. She noticed additional details. The older man always positioned the tray at a precise angle, the bag's folded edge facing outward toward the dining room. The younger man never hesitated when he approached the bin. He knew exactly which tray to take, and the bag Lena focused on the bag always appeared to have weight, a subtle fullness that suggested contents, though she had watched the older man eat everything he had ordered. On February 2nd, 1982, during the third occurrence Elena witnessed, she decided to pay closer attention to what the younger man did at his table during those 30 to 45 seconds when he held the bag. She positioned herself at the soda fountain, appearing to refill ice, and watched from an oblique angle. The younger man opened the bag. His hands moved inside it, hidden from view. Then his hands emerged, and he reached into his jacket pocket. Then his hands went back into the bag. The movements were quick, practiced, economical. When he returned to dispose of the bag, Elena noticed something she hadn't seen before. The bag appeared slightly flatter, as if something had been removed, or perhaps something had been added. She couldn't be certain. The entire interaction lasted seconds. February 19th marked the 4th exchange Elena observed, and this time she watched with the specific intention of understanding what was being transferred, and in which direction the transfer occurred. The older man arrived at 5:48 p.m., ordered his Big Mac meal, sat in his usual booth, ate with his usual methodical pace, and left his tray with the white bag upright on the ledge. Elena memorized every detail. The bag was folded 3 times at the top, the creases sharp and deliberate, not the casual crumpling of someone discarding actual food waste. The younger man entered at 5:59 p.m., ordered a filet-o-fish meal, sat near the eastern windows, finished eating in 9 minutes, approached the waste bin, and took the tray with the white bag. But this time, Elena observed something definitive. When the younger man sat with the bag, she saw him remove a small object from his jacket pocket. She couldn't identify what it was, something small enough to be concealed in a closed fist, and she watched him insert that object into the bag. Not remove, insert. The direction of transfer was now clear. The younger man was leaving something for the older man, or rather the older man had left something to create the appearance of an ordinary McDonald's bag, and the younger man was adding his own contents before the bag disappeared into the waste receptacle, where presumably someone would later retrieve it. Elena felt her pulse accelerate, felt the cold clarity of recognition that what she was witnessing was not innocent, not coincidence, not an inside joke between coworkers. This was structured. This was intentional. This was designed to appear completely ordinary while being anything but. She confided in Grace Miller on March 1st, 1982, during a quiet moment in the early afternoon before the dinner rush began. Grace had worked at the restaurant for 5 years, longer than Elena, and possessed the kind of unflappable pragmatism that came from raising 3 children while working full-time. Elena described what she had seen: the pattern, the timing, the bag, the transfers, and Grace listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from polite attention to focused concern. Grace's first question was direct and clarifying. "Are you sure they re not just friends meeting for dinner?" Elena explained that friends acknowledge each other, that friends sit together, that friends don't operate with the mechanical precision of synchronized watches. Grace's second question was more unsettling. "What do you think is in the bag?" Elena had been avoiding that question, had been circling around it for weeks, but now she spoke the thought aloud. "I think they're passing information. I think this is espionage." The word hung in the air between them, sounding melodramatic and absurd in the context of a McDonald's dining room where families ate happy meals and teenagers worked their first jobs. But Grace didn't laugh. Grace had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, had watched Soviet tanks roll into Prague on television, had raised children during a time when nuclear war drills were routine in elementary schools. She understood that the Cold War wasn't fought only in Berlin or Moscow or Washington conference rooms. It was fought in parking lots and apartment buildings, and anywhere 2 people could meet without attracting attention. She asked Elena what she wanted to do. Elena said she wanted to know what was in the bag. The plan was simple, perhaps dangerously simple in retrospect, but neither Elena nor Grace were trained intelligence officers, and they operated with the tools available to them: observation, timing, and the element of surprise that comes from being dismissed as irrelevant. They waited for the next scheduled exchange, which Elena had calculated would occur approximately 2 weeks after the February 19th incident, meaning early March, likely the first or second week. On March 4th, 1982, the older man arrived at his usual time, 5:47 p.m., carrying out his usual routine with mechanical precision. Elena worked the front register. Grace positioned herself near the waste receptacle, ostensibly cleaning tables, carrying a damp cloth and a spray bottle of disinfectant. The older man finished his meal, disposed of his trash, left the tray with the white bag upright on the ledge, and exited through the glass doors. Elena and Grace exchanged a glance. They had perhaps 8 to 12 minutes before the younger man would arrive. Grace moved quickly. She lifted the white bag from the tray, carried it to the back storage room where inventory was kept and where no customers could observe, and opened it. Inside, wrapped in an inner layer of wax paper as if protecting food, were 3 strips of what appeared to be photographic film, each approximately 2 inches long, dark and semi-transparent, with tiny images visible when held to the light. Grace didn't touch them. She closed the bag carefully, returned to the dining area, and replaced the bag on the tray exactly as it had been positioned, folded edge facing outward, upright against the wall. The entire operation took 90 seconds. When the younger man arrived at 5:58 p.m., everything appeared undisturbed. He followed his usual pattern, ordered food, ate quickly, approached the waste bin, took the tray with the bag, returned to his table, and performed his 30-second manipulation. But Elena and Grace now knew what he was manipulating. They knew what was inside the bag. They knew they had witnessed something that belonged in the hands of federal law enforcement. Agent Thomas R. Leland of the FBI's Washington field office received Elena Torres's phone call on March 5, 1982, at approximately 9:30 a.m. He had spent 23 years in counterintelligence work, had investigated Soviet espionage networks throughout the 1960s and 1970s, had developed sources inside Eastern European diplomatic missions, and had cultivated the patient skepticism of someone who had heard hundreds of tips that led nowhere. When Elena explained that she believed she had witnessed a dead drop operation at a McDonald's in Alexandria, Leland's initial response was polite, but non-committal fast food restaurants were public spaces where people met for legitimate reasons, where coincidences occurred, where pattern-seeking minds sometimes found patterns that didn't exist. But Elena's description changed his assessment. She used specific terminology without knowing she was using it. Dead drop, signal, transfer. She described the timing with precision, exact arrival times, duration of contact, synchronized movements. She mentioned the microfilm strips, which elevated the situation from possible to probable. Leland asked her to describe the men in detail. The older man, silver hair, late 50s, methodical movements, business attire, no distinguishing features, deliberately unmemorable. The younger man, 40 years old, wire-rimmed glasses, khaki pants, polo shirts, light blue Ford sedan from the mid-1970s, also deliberately unremarkable. Leland asked if Elena had kept the microfilm. She said no, that she had replaced it exactly as found, that the younger man had taken the bag and presumably added his own contents before disposal. Leland told her he would investigate. He told her not to interfere further. He told her that if what she described was accurate, she had potentially identified a significant security breach. Then he assembled a surveillance team. The FBI's approach to the McDonald's operation reflected decades of refined counterintelligence tradecraft adapted to the specific constraints of a public restaurant in a busy commercial district. Leland's team consisted of 8 rotating plainclothes agents who entered the establishment as ordinary customers during the late afternoon and early evening hours, ordering food, occupying tables, appearing completely unremarkable while maintaining overlapping fields of observation covering the waste receptacle of the entrance, the parking lot, and every table in the dining area. Additional agents positioned themselves in unmarked vehicles along Duke Street and in the adjacent parking lots, ready to follow either man when they departed. The surveillance began on March 8th and continued daily through the end of the month. The older man appeared twice during this period, March 11th and March 25th. Each time, the pattern Elena had described repeated with mechanical precision. Arrival at 5:47 p.m. Big Mac meal, newspaper, 18-minute dining duration. Tray left upright with white bag, departure. The younger man followed 8 to 12 minutes later both times, executing the brief exchange at the waste receptacle before leaving in his light blue Ford sedan. FBI tail units followed him on March 25th to an apartment complex in Falls Church called Eastgate Apartments, a sprawling development of 3-story brick buildings housing young professionals and government contractors. The vehicle registration came back to Marcus Hawley, age 41, employed by TriStar Defense Systems, a Pentagon subcontractor specializing in radar technology and electronic warfare systems. The name Marcus Hall triggered an immediate cross-reference check against security clearance databases, which revealed that Hawley held a secret-level clearance and had access to classified radar algorithm research related to early missile defense systems and NATO air defense coordination. The stakes of the investigation had just escalated from possible espionage to confirmed national security breach. TriStar Defense Systems occupied a low-profile office complex in Tysons Corner, Virginia, where approximately 200 engineers and technical staff worked on contracts related to radar systems, electronic countermeasures, and satellite-based targeting research. The work was highly classified, compartmentalized into specific projects with strict access controls, requiring employees to log every entry into secure areas and to document every file they reviewed. Marcus Hawley worked as an electrical systems engineer in the Advanced Radar Development Division, which gave him access to technical specifications, algorithm designs, and performance data for systems being developed to detect low-altitude Soviet aircraft and cruise missiles. The FBI obtained authorization to review TriStar's internal security logs without alerting the company to the investigation's focus. What they discovered confirmed the worst-case scenario. Hawley had accessed files related to radar signal processing algorithms 17 times in the previous 6 months, far more frequently than his project assignments required. More damning, copy machine logs from the secure engineering facility showed that Hale had made photocopies during late evening hours when fewer personnel were present, creating opportunities to reproduce classified documents without immediate oversight. The technical analysis of the microfilm strips Elena and Grace had briefly observed revealed additional troubling details. FBI forensic laboratories examined similar strips recovered during a controlled surveillance operation, where agents intercepted a dead drop bag before the handler could retrieve it. The film was manufactured using acetate stock consistent with Soviet and East German production methods. Chemical analysis detected processing signatures matching standards used in Eastern Bloc photographic facilities. The images on the film strips, when enlarged, showed technical schematics for radar algorithms, performance charts, and handwritten engineering notes, all materials that would enable Soviet engineers to develop countermeasures against NATO radar systems. The investigation's focus shifted to identifying the older man, the handler, who received Hale's deliveries and who operated with the professional discipline of someone trained in intelligence tradecraft. The FBI reviewed surveillance footage from multiple angles, but the man's appearance offered frustratingly few identifying characteristics. No visible scars, no distinctive mannerisms, no unique clothing choices, nothing that would enable facial recognition software of 1982 vintage to generate useful leads. Agents canvassed businesses near the McDonald's, showing photographs to employees at the dry cleaner, the hardware store, the gas station across Duke Street. No one recognized him. No one remembered seeing him regularly except at McDonald's. His vehicle, when agents finally identified it during the March 25th surveillance, was registered under a Canadian driver's license to a name that later proved to be false. Documentation listed him as Sergei Antonov, a technical consultant for a telecommunications firm based in Ottawa, though subsequent investigation revealed no such firm existed and no Canadian entry records matched that name. The FBI suspected they were dealing with a KGB officer operating under an alias, possibly someone from Line X, the KGB division responsible for scientific and technical intelligence collection. But without conclusive identification, without an arrest, the handler remained a phantom moving through Northern Virginia's landscape of defense contractors and government employees. The FBI strategy evolved into a two-phase operation designed to secure both the asset and the handler. Phase 1 involved continued surveillance of Hale to document his pattern of access to classified materials and to build an prosecutable case for espionage charges. Phase 2 required more delicate execution, creating a controlled situation where the handler would appear at the McDonald's as dead, drop site under circumstances that would enable arrest. Leland proposed using a technique called bait, microfilm creating fake technical documents containing intentionally flawed radar formulas that would appear legitimate to Hale, but would be recognizable to Soviet engineers as compromised once analyzed. The theory was that Hale would photograph these documents, deliver them via the dead drop, and the handler would appear to retrieve them, giving the FBI an opportunity to make arrests at both ends simultaneously. The plan required TriStar Defense Systems to cooperate, which meant bringing company security personnel into the investigation without alerting Hale that he was under suspicion. In April 1982, TriStar's security director implemented a new document verification procedure that involved placing marked files in the secure engineering area and monitoring which employees accessed them. The bait documents were inserted into Hale's accessible files on April 18th. Surveillance confirmed that Hale accessed and photographed these documents on April 22nd. The trap was set. The McDonald's dead drop was scheduled to occur based on the established 2-week pattern, which meant the exchange would likely happen during the first week of May. May 6, 1982, marked the convergence of months of investigation, careful surveillance, and calculated risk. FBI teams positioned themselves throughout West Alexandria that evening with military precision. Inside the McDonald's, 4 agents occupied tables, appearing as ordinary customers eating ordinary meals. Outside, 16 additional agents waited in vehicles and on foot, maintaining radio contact, prepared to move simultaneously when the signal came. The older man, the handler, Sergei Antonov, or whatever his real name might be, was scheduled to arrive at 5:47 p.m., based on the established pattern. Marcus Halle would follow 8 to 12 minutes later. The plan was to allow the initial drop to occur to permit Halle to leave the microfilm in the white bag to let him depart the restaurant, and then to arrest him at his apartment before he could destroy evidence or alert his handler. Meanwhile, other agents would wait for the handler to return and retrieve the bag from the waste receptacle, at which point they would move in for arrest. The operation depended on precise timing, on patience, on allowing both men to commit actions that would constitute prosecutable espionage. At 5:47 p.m., exactly on schedule, the older man entered through the glass doors. He ordered his Big Mac meal. He sat in his usual booth. He read the business section of the Washington Post. He finished eating in 18 minutes. He approached the waste receptacle, disposed of his trash, and left the tray with the white bag upright on the ledge. He walked to the glass doors and exited to the parking lot. FBI agents made no move. Phase 1 complete. At 5:59 p.m., Marcus Halle entered the McDonald's. He ordered a quarter-pounder meal. He sat near the eastern windows. He ate for 9 minutes. He stood, walked to the waste bin, took the tray with the white bag, returned to his table, opened the bag, inserted the microfilm strips containing the bait radar algorithms, refolded the bag, returned to the waste bin, disposed of everything, and walked to the exit. FBI arrest teams moved the moment he reached the parking lot. 4 agents converged on Halle as he approached his light blue Ford sedan, identified themselves, informed him he was under arrest for espionage, and placed him in handcuffs. He offered no resistance. He said nothing. His expression registered something between resignation and relief, as if the weight of 2 years operating as a Soviet asset had finally been lifted. But the handler never returned. FBI agents maintained surveillance on the McDonald's for the next 6 hours, watching the waste receptacle, monitoring every person who entered the building, searching for any sign that Sergei Antonov would appear to retrieve his delivery. He never came. The overnight shift came and went. Restaurant employees disposed of the evening's trash, including the bag containing the baked microfilm, which agents recovered from the dumpster behind the building at 11:30 p.m. The handler had somehow known that the operation was compromised, had somehow sensed that the pattern had been disrupted, had exercised the professional paranoia that keeps intelligence officers alive in hostile environments. Whether he observed unusual activity around the McDonald's, whether he noticed the unmarked FBI vehicles, whether he had alternate surveillance of his own that detected the arrest teams, or whether he simply decided that hail as precisely timed. Arrival and departure felt slightly wrong. The FBI would never determine which factor triggered his decision to abort. What they did know was that Sergei Antonov disappeared completely that night. No one matching his description appeared at the McDonald's during subsequent surveillance. No Canadian citizen named Sergei Antonov crossed back into Canada through any monitored border point. The light-colored sedan registered under that name was found abandoned in a long-term parking lot at Dulles International Airport 3 weeks later, wiped clean of fingerprints, offering no useful evidence. The FBI suspected he had exfiltrated using a pre-planned escape protocol false passport, alternative identity, probably a flight to Mexico or Canada, followed by circuitous routing back to Moscow through third countries. He had vanished into the operational darkness that intelligence officers inhabit, leaving behind only questions and one compromised asset. Marcus Halle confessed on May 8, 1982, after 2 days of interrogation, during which FBI agents presented documentation of his file. Access patterns, his photocopy logs, his vehicle's presence at the McDonald's during each dead drop occurrence, and witness testimony from Elena Torres and Grace Miller. His confession filled 47 pages of typed testimony and provided investigators with a detailed chronology of his recruitment and operation as a Soviet intelligence asset. The story began in 1979 at a Washington, D.C. amateur radio club meeting, where Hale, an enthusiast of shortwave radio technology, met a man who introduced himself as a visiting Canadian communications technician interested in learning about American broadcasting equipment. The man was friendly, knowledgeable, interested in the technical details that fascinated Hall. They met several more times over the following months, always at public locations, always discussing radio technology and electronics, gradually building what appeared to be a genuine friendship between two men who shared specialized interests. The man eventually revealed that he worked for a company interested in purchasing American technical specifications for commercial radar systems, and he offered to pay Hale for his expertise in evaluating certain engineering documents. The payments were modest, at first $500 for reviewing technical papers, $1,000 for explaining specific algorithms. Hale, who was struggling financially after a divorce, and who harbored resentment toward TriStar's management over a denied promotion, accepted the arrangement. He rationalized it as consulting work, as legitimate technical advice provided to a foreign company, as nothing more serious than sharing information that would eventually become public knowledge anyway. The rationalization collapsed only gradually as the requests became more specific, as the payments increased to $5,000 per delivery, as the man introduced the McDonald's dead drop protocol and explained the timing signals and the necessity for absolute operational security. By the time Hale understood he was committing espionage, he had already delivered classified radar algorithms that could enable Soviet engineers to develop jamming systems against NATO air defense networks. He had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He continued for 2 years, because stopping would mean confessing, because he needed the money, because he was trapped in a machinery of consequence that extended far beyond his personal choices. The federal case against Marcus Hale proceeded with bureaucratic inevitability through the Eastern District of Virginia court system. Prosecutors charged him with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 794, which carried a maximum penalty of life imprisonment or death. In exchange for his cooperation and his detailed confession, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Hale pleaded guilty to conspiracy to deliver national defense information to a foreign government. The sentencing hearing in March 1983 lasted 4 hours and included testimony from Department of Defense officials describing the defense strategic value of the radar algorithms Hale had compromised and the operational damage caused by their disclosure to Soviet intelligence services. The judge acknowledged Hale's cooperation, but emphasized that espionage represented a betrayal of the most fundamental obligations of citizenship and security clearance. Marcus Hale was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. He served 14 years before being released on parole in 1997, re-entering a world transformed by the Cold War's end and the Soviet Union's collapse. He lived the remainder of his life in obscurity working maintenance, jobs never speaking publicly about his espionage activities, carrying the weight of consequences that began with a conversation about shortwave radios and ended with radar algorithms photographed on microfilm strips hidden inside McDonald's takeout bags. The handler of the man, who called himself Sergei Antonov, was never captured, never identified with certainty, never held accountable for his role in recruiting and managing an intelligence asset on American soil. FBI counterintelligence analysts suspected he was a KGB Line X officer, probably someone with technical training, who could evaluate the quality of the information Hale provided, possibly someone who had operated in North America for years under deep cover, building legends and cultivating sources. CIA liaison officers reviewing the case suggested he might have been reassigned to Soviet operations in Europe or recalled to Moscow, depending on whether KGB leadership considered his exposure in the United States a compromising factor requiring extraction or simply an operational setback requiring relocation. The case remained officially open in FBI files, listed among hundreds of unresolved Cold War espionage investigations where handlers escaped, and assets were caught, where the visible portions of intelligence networks were dismantled while the invisible portions slipped away. Decades later, after the Soviet Union's dissolution and the opening of some KGB archives, researchers searching for references to operations in Northern Virginia during the early 1980s found fragmentary mentions of an asset codenamed Beacon, who provided radar intelligence but was arrested before completing a planned 2-year assignment. The handler's name appeared in no accessible records. His fate remained unknown, lost somewhere in the bureaucratic layers of an intelligence apparatus that no longer existed except in historical archives and aging memories. Elena Torres and Grace Miller received private acknowledgement from the FBI for their role in identifying the espionage operation, but their contributions remained classified for years under regulations protecting counterintelligence, sources, and methods. The McDonald's management never learned the full details of what had occurred in their dining room, never understood that an international espionage case had unfolded near their waste receptacle during ordinary evening shifts. Elena left McDonald's in 1984 to work in Alexandria City Administration, never speaking publicly about her role until declassified FBI case files made limited details available decades later. Grace Miller continued working at the restaurant until her retirement in 1989, occasionally reflecting on the strange winter when two men who never spoke to each other became the focus of a federal investigation that dismantled a Soviet intelligence operation. Neither woman sought recognition or compensation for their actions. They had simply noticed an anomaly in ordinary life, investigated it with the tools available to them, and reported what they found to appropriate authorities. Their ordinariness was precisely what made their contribution significant intelligence. Work in the Cold War era wasn't conducted only by trained officers with sophisticated equipment, but also by ordinary citizens who paid attention, who trusted their observations, who recognized when patterns of behavior deviated from the normal rhythms of American life. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the specific individuals involved, revealing structural vulnerabilities in how classified information was accessed and controlled within defense contractor environments. During the early 1980s, TriStar Defense Systems implemented enhanced security protocols after the investigation, including random document access audits, mandatory polygraph testing for employees with secret clearances working on radar projects, and physical security improvements to prevent after-hours copying of sensitive materials. The Department of Defense reviewed security procedures across dozens of similar contractors and instituted requirements for more frequent background investigations and continuous evaluation programs designed to identify employees experiencing financial stress or exhibiting behavioral changes that might indicate vulnerability to foreign intelligence recruitment. These reforms, implemented across the defense industrial base throughout the mid-1980s, made it significantly more difficult for foreign intelligence services to exploit mid-level technical employees, though determined adversaries continued to probe for weaknesses wherever American classified information existed. The KGB's Line X operations continued targeting American technical intelligence throughout the Cold War's final decade, recruiting new assets, developing new tradecraft, adapting to enhanced American counterintelligence, while American agencies adapted to Soviet innovations in an endless operational dialectic that characterized espionage in the nuclear age. The McDonald's itself continued operating for another 2 decades, serving Big Macs and fries to commuters and families, remaining a completely ordinary restaurant in a commercial strip along Duke Street in West Alexandria, until the building was finally demolished in 2004 to make way for a residential development. Nothing marked the location as historically significant. No plaque commemorated the events that unfolded there. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred existed in sealed FBI case files and court records archived in federal repositories, and in the memories of the handful of people who knew what had actually happened during those carefully orchestrated exchanges that appeared to be nothing more than two men disposing of their dinner trash. This was the nature of Cold War espionage: profound betrayals occurring in mundane settings, international security breaches unfolding in parking lots and bus stops and fast food restaurants, ordinary people making extraordinary decisions that shaped geopolitical outcomes in ways that remained hidden for decades. The war between intelligence services was fought not only in dramatic confrontations, but in thousands of small, careful transactions where microfilm changed hands and radar algorithms were photographed and handlers disappeared into the landscape before anyone could determine who they really were. What remains most haunting about the case is the human dimension of betrayal. Marcus Halle was an ideological true believer committed to Soviet communism, but rather an ordinary engineer who made small compromises that cascaded into treason, who rationalized each step until he found himself trapped in circumstances that offered no escape except confession and imprisonment. The handler operated with professional detachment, treating Halle as an intelligence asset rather than a human being cultivating his financial desperation and personal resentment to serve Soviet strategic interests without apparent concern for the consequences Halle would face when the operation inevitably collapsed. Elena Torres and Grace Miller demonstrated the quiet courage of ordinary citizenship, recognizing something wrong and taking action despite the personal risk and uncertainty involved. And somewhere in the archives of former Soviet intelligence agencies, if they still exist at all, there are presumably records of the radar algorithms Halle provided, technical specifications that enabled Soviet engineers to develop countermeasures that altered the balance of electronic warfare capabilities, that justified the operational risks and the human costs, because intelligence services measure success not in individual lives, but in strategic advantages gained through information acquired by any means necessary. The Cold War demanded these moral compromises from everyone involved: spies who betrayed their countries, handlers who manipulated vulnerable people, counterintelligence officers who built cases knowing handlers would escape, and ordinary citizens who discovered that their ordinary world contained extraordinary secrets hidden in plain sight, waiting to be noticed by anyone who looked carefully enough to see what didn't quite fit in the landscape of normal life. This is what the Cold War was ultimately: not the grand confrontations dramatized in films, but the small betrayals occurring in McDonald's dining rooms on Thursday evenings in winter, where two men passed microfilm strips without ever acknowledging each other's existence.